Today, we're diving into the world of a Victorian poet who completely broke the mold. A true master of literary disguise, Robert Browning. He basically invented a new way for characters to tell their own stories, and in doing so, he changed poetry forever. So let's get into how he pulled it off. Okay, so when you think poetry, this probably isn't what comes to mind, right? It's not smooth, it's not melodic. It sounds like a dog is growling at you. And this jarring, almost ugly line is the perfect way to enter Browning's very unique world. So that's the real mystery we're unpacking. Who was this guy who just ripped up the poetry rulebook and decided to write stuff that was rugged, conversational, and, let's be honest, sometimes really difficult to get through? And the answer, maybe surprisingly, starts with a huge public failure. Yeah, you heard that right. Our story doesn't kick off with some big win. Nope. It starts with a young, super ambitious poet getting his heart absolutely shattered. Not by a lover, but by a critic. I mean, this guy was a total prodigy. He was born in London and was basically homeschooled inside this incredible library his dad had. We're talking 6,000 books. So by the time he was just 14, he knew 4 languages. He was brilliant, and he poured every ounce of that brilliance, his whole soul, into his very first published poem, Pauline. And this was the response he got. Absolutely devastating. The famous philosopher John Stuart Mill pretty much called the poem an act of cringy self-obsession. For a young poet who'd idolized Shelley and put his deepest feelings out there on the page, a critique like this was just crushing. So Browning made a vow right then and there. He decided he would never again write about himself directly. He would never again expose his own soul to be torn apart by the critics. But that raises a huge question, right? How can you be a poet if you can't write from the heart? He was going to spend years trying to figure that one out. The next chapter of his life, though, wasn't about solving literary puzzles. It was about one of the most famous love stories in history, a romance that would completely change his perspective and give him a new home. So, in 1845, he starts writing to Elizabeth Barrett, who, by the way, was already way more famous than he was. She was a semi-invalid, basically held captive by her domineering father. Their entire courtship happened through letters. And then, just a year later, they get married in secret and just flee to Italy. It's so dramatic. Italy became his creative sanctuary for the next 15 years, and the art and history all around him would fuel his greatest work. So it's here, in Italy, that Browning finally cracks the code. He figures out the perfect solution to that vow he'd made as a heartbroken young man. A way to write with all the psychological depth he wanted, without ever having to speak in his own voice. He basically perfected this form called the dramatic monologue. The best way to think of it is like a one-act play squeezed inside a poem. You have one single character, someone who is definitely not the poet, speaking their mind at a super critical moment. And here's the simple 3-step process for how it works. First, a speaker steps onto the stage. Maybe it's a jealous Renaissance duke or a shady monk, whatever. Second, you realize they're not just talking to themselves. They're talking to someone else who we never hear from. This is a clever trick that makes you, the reader, feel like you're eavesdropping. And third, and this is the real genius of it, while telling their side of the story, the speaker accidentally reveals who they really are, all their flaws, their biases, their deepest, darkest secrets. Okay, so what does this actually look and sound like on the page? Let's dive into how this technique, combined with Browning's one-of-a-kind style, created something totally new in English literature. To really get just how different Browning was, all you have to do is compare him to his most famous contemporary, Alfred Lord Tennyson. Think of Tennyson's poetry as this beautiful flowing river. It's melodic, it's melancholy. Browning? He was the complete opposite. His stuff was rugged. It sounded like real people talking, and he made you work for it. He had a few key moves. For one, he'd just throw you into the middle of a scene with no warning. He also loved using what's called cacophony, just harsh, clashing sounds that mimic how we actually speak, instead of, pretty, smooth rhythms. And finally, he used these fragmented, complex sentences that forced you to piece together the meaning, just like you have to do in a real, messy conversation. His poem, My Last Duchess, is the perfect example. So you're listening to the sophisticated duke, right? He's showing off a painting of his late wife to a guest. But as he talks, this charming mask just starts to crack. And through his own words, complaining about how she smiled too much at others, he reveals this chilling, possessive nature that makes it pretty clear he gave the commands to have her killed. He condemns himself and doesn't even see it. So, this revolutionary technique of getting inside a character's head wasn't just some clever trick, it had a massive impact. It basically paved the way for the future of literature. And his ambition? It was just staggering. He took everything he'd learned and poured it into this epic masterpiece that clocked in at over 21,000 lines. To give you some perspective, that's more than 3 times longer than Homer's entire Odyssey. The poem was called The Ring and the Book. The idea behind it was just mind-blowing for the time. It was based on a real murder trial from 17th century Rome, but instead of just telling the story once, Browning tells it 12 different times from 12 different perspectives. You hear from the husband, the wife, the lawyers, the pope, even the town gossips. It's this incredible deep dive into the idea that truth is never simple. So, what's the big takeaway here? Look, Browning's obsession with what was going on inside his characters' heads, that was the bridge. He's the guy who connects the emotional poetry of the Romantics to the psychologically complex world of the modernists. You just don't get poets like T.S. Eliot or Ezra Pound without Browning paving the way. And all of this leaves us with a really potent question, one that feels more relevant today than ever. Browning's work really makes you ask, when we're only getting one person's side of the story, when a character is their own narrator, can we ever really know the truth? Or are we all just masters of disguise?